ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hi, Patricia Carvelis here from the new podcast Politics Now. And as the federal election campaign kicks off, I'm joined by the ABC's sharpest minds like David Spears.
The old saying is, you throw enough mud and some will stick. But I would add to that it can come back at you sometimes as well, and you both end up a bit splattered.
It's called Politics Now, and you can find it on the ABC Listen app.
Hi, it's Sam Hawley here. Thank you for all the suggestions you've sent so far on what we should be looking at during this election campaign. We've had lots of really great ideas. And for this episode, we're picking up on Eric's query about how much Australia really needs to spend to defend our country. Both major parties think we need to spend more. But what is the threat we have to be ready for? Today, Sam Roggeveen, Director of the Lowy Institute's International Security Program, on whether we really need to boost funding. From Gadigal Land in Sydney, this is ABC News Daily. So our listener Eric asks about Australia's defence budget.
G'day Sam, I would like to hear more about Peter Dutton's policy to increase defence spending up to 2.5% GDP. Could the podcast explain what warrants additional spending in defence? Given the cost of living challenges, there's no shortage of areas for government to focus on.
Thanks so much for your question, Eric. And just noting that the Coalition has hinted at increasing spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2029, but it hasn't actually fully committed to that just yet.
Mr Speaker, during the election campaign, we will announce our significant funding commitment to defence, a commitment which, unlike Labor's, will be commensurate with the challenges of our times. We will provide support to the Australian Defence Force to keep us safe today and into generations ahead, at a time when we most need it.
Sam, we've got this question about defence spending, so we're going to get you to unpack the arguments for and against increasing the amount we currently spend. But look, before we get there, we're debating this, of course, because of Donald Trump. He's made it an issue for the world, hasn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't want to downplay the Trump effect here, but we're only 2 months in and we shouldn't make huge decisions about our defence, about our foreign policy on the evidence of 2 months. What we should do is look at long-term trends. And unfortunately, when you do look at the long-term trends, then continued support of the alliance above all else as a way to secure Australia and to defend its interests looks like a shakier and shakier bet. It was not a bad bet in the past. Australia has, I think, justifiably relied on the United States. The US is making a very solid and I think justifiable national interest decision that a military competition against China would be such a huge endeavour that you would only do it if your vital national interests are at stake. And actually, I think implicitly what the Americans are saying is actually our vital interests are not at stake here. The United States remains an incredibly secure country. China, even at its absolute peak, would not be a threat to the United States. And therefore, I think the obvious conclusion we and other allies in the region have to draw is that we just need to do more for ourselves.
Yeah, and of course a lot of the messaging coming from Trump at the moment is really directed at NATO nations, isn't it? The threat is that the United States will abandon them if they don't spend more.
If they don't pay, I'm not going to defend them. No, I'm not going to defend them. I got into a lot of heat when I said that. You said, oh, he's violating NATO.
That's right. And the great hope here in the Asia Pacific, and I think including in Australia, is that the pivot that Obama announced years ago in 2011, that's finally happening, that where the Americans withdraw from Europe and maybe even a little bit from the Middle East, they will move those forces and move their effort towards the Asia Pacific.
Well, Trump is demanding, of course, that European nations lift their spending to something like 5%, which is, for some of them, a pretty big increase.
Which is what it should have been years ago. It was only at 2%, and most nations didn't pay until I came along. I insisted that they pay, and they did.
You know, some of those European nations' defence spending sitting at around 2%. But they're responding right. The German Chancellor says Germany needs independence from the USA. Canada says the relationship with the United States is kind of almost over. Poland, it's talking about getting nuclear weapons. So it's changing the landscape, that's for sure.
Absolutely. Look, I don't think the Europeans need to go to 5%. Collectively, the European economies are 10 times that of Russia. So it should not be beyond them to defend themselves independently. They also have very mature and very impressive military industrial complex that can build advanced weapons. So the military problem that the Europeans have got is solvable even without the Americans.
Yeah.
The question of nuclear weapons, of course, is a bit dicier.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that's a political problem. Can the Europeans unify enough without the Americans providing leadership so that they can have a collective response to Russian aggression?
Of course, we are a member of AUKUS, which is the security partnership with the UK and the United States. It was a little worrying, wasn't it, when Trump seemed to not know what that was?
You're discussing AUKUS with the Prime Minister, sir.
What does that mean?
AUKUS, the Australia-US Defence Alliance.
No, well, we'll be discussing that. We've had a...
That part of it I'm not too worried about. I mean, at that level, it shouldn't shock us too much that presidents are not across the detail. I think the more relevant worry here is that you mentioned Canada, for instance. The Canadians now are in a position where they are rethinking major defence contracts with the United States because they're just not certain that America is a reliable partner in that regard. Now, Australia's in a different position. We are much less exposed to America economically than Canada is, and physically we're further away. So it's different for us. But yeah, you do have to wonder whether at the very top level, whether AUKUS could become a bargaining chip for the Trump administration, or whether the Trump administration simply decides that this is not a good bargain, especially if it means that in order to supply Australia with submarines, that America will have fewer submarines. So I think if that becomes the bargain, then I'd be really surprised if Trump accepts it.
All right, Sam, so let's turn back to that question of our own spending, which was posed by Eric, our listener. So there have been reports, of course, that suggest that Peter Dutton could increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, although there's no firm commitment on that just yet. So just give me a quick history lesson, though, first of all. Where is it sitting now and how high has it been in the past?
Well, it's sitting at a little over 2% at the moment, but that moves around a little bit depending on currency movements. So GDP is not a great guide for how much we're spending on defence. And of course, when our currency is weak, as it is at the moment, it costs a lot more to buy American weapons in particular, which is the kind of weapons that we buy most of. Look, historically, in wartime, we've gone well over 5-6%. And even during the Cold War, it was typically over 3%. So in historical terms, it shouldn't be beyond us to lift defence spending significantly. My primary concern really is whether it's necessary, whether we're much better focusing on how we spend the money we're spending now rather than simply spending more. I mean, I'm a long-standing critic of AUKUS, so I would start there. That's a major bit of expenditure there that I think in future threatens to devour the entire naval shipbuilding budget. So I would start there, but also I think there are a lot of capabilities that we are investing in that are not the best use of our dollar.
There are people that argue it does need to be up at that 3%, again, including the former Defence Minister, Kim Beazley. So what are they arguing? Why do they think it needs to increase so substantially?
Well, I think what they're arguing is the same thing that successive governments have now argued, including Morrison and now Albanese, which is that Australia's strategic circumstances are more uncertain than they've been since the Second World War. So they regard the rise of China as the most significant strategic change to our region since the Second World War, and that it threatens the regional order and Australia's place within it, even more than the Soviet Union and the Cold War did. Now, I think they're right about that, But where I think they're off target is that is primarily a military challenge for Australia. My argument's always been that Australia is actually relatively easy to defend by international standards. I mean, we're not South Korea, we're certainly not Taiwan. Beijing is closer to Berlin than it is to Sydney.
Yeah, you like to consider the Defence Force, don't you, more like an echidna?
Right.
So just explain that.
I chose that creature as a metaphor because echidnas are benign and friendly to those that mean them no harm, but they are prickly and indigestible to those who do. And that, I think, is a good defence posture for Australia. So typically, throughout our history, there's been a debate among defence strategists about what the Australian Defence Force is actually for. There's one group that says the Australian Defence Force is designed to operate alongside our major power ally, the United States, to maintain the regional order. The other school, to which I belong, says, no, the job of the Australian Defence Force is very simple and very limited. It's to defend the Australian continent and defend Australia's territory. And I think now, particularly in light of the moves of the Trump administration, it's simply not reasonable to base Australian defence policy on allying itself with the United States and its defence of the regional order.
Can we really defend ourselves against a nation like China, if it came down to that, without America's support and without a substantial increase in defence funding?
Yeah, well, it's important to stress here that when I say without American support, what I mean is that I don't think it's likely in the future that the Americans will have the will or the resolve to have their soldiers and airmen and sailors die in defence of Australia. I think we'll always get support in terms of intelligence, arms supplies. We'll keep exercising with them. We will keep training with them. If we were ever attacked, it would be a bit like Ukraine. We get an awful lot of help, but we never get direct American military support. And can we defend ourselves that way? Yeah, absolutely. Because although China's so much bigger than us and the Chinese military is so much bigger than ours, distance protects us. It's very hard to project all of that force many thousands of kilometres south. So that Chinese flotilla that we all heard about that circumnavigated Australia recently, I mean, they had to come over 7,000 kilometres from their Southern Fleet headquarters just to sail around Australia. That's a massive effort. You know, even if it was a slightly bigger fleet, and they will get bigger in future, you're still not able to project very much force against Australia. And of course, Australia can defend itself. We can buy the capabilities, the weapons and the aircraft that can sink fleets like that.
Is it just that we're worried that we could be invaded by China, for instance, or is there other things at play as well, that there could be an influence going on from a nation like China?
There is no defence commentator thinks that there is a realistic prospect of Australia being invaded by China. But what they do fear is the use of the Chinese military to coerce Australia. So missile and bomber strikes against Australian military bases or even against Australian cities and its infrastructure. That is a realistic fear in a large-scale crisis, that Australia could be subjected to that kind of military coercion.
Well, as our listener Eric points out, during a cost of living crisis, if you want to increase defence spending, and of course we talk about it percentage-wise compared to GDP, but that's actually billions and billions of dollars, right? It's a lot of money.
Right.
So what governments would have to find that money from somewhere, from other programs or from increasing taxes, right? So that would be a tough sell, would it, to put to Australians, or would they accept that that's necessary?
Well, at the moment, I think Australian governments are avoiding that question. So both major parties are in favour of increasing defence spending.
We've invested an extra $50 billion in defence by the mid-2030s to help keep Australians safe. It means defence funding will grow beyond 2.3% of GDP by the early 2030s.
But the Liberals at the moment, they're signalling that they want to increase it even further than Labor. But neither side has really explained how they're going to pay for it. The fact that both sides are so reluctant to have that conversation with Australians does suggest that they believe that Australians are not prepared to make major sacrifices in that regard.
So what do you think then, Sam? You seem to be arguing that an increase in defence spending is not necessary. Can we sit at that 2% rate for a long time to come?
Yeah, I still don't think the argument has been made for higher defence spending. I would like to see defence spending radically redirected towards the kind of capabilities that I've talked about already. But you can do that under the existing budget. Major increases, I think, need to be further justified.
Sam Roggeveen is the director of the Lowy Institute's International Security Program. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed. Audio production by Adair Shepherd and Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.